The morning sun painted golden streaks across the cobblestone streets of the mountain village, where Marija had spent every day of her 19 years. She loved mornings like this, when the air still held the cool touch of night and the smell of fresh bread drifted from her family's bakery window. Marija wiped flour from her hands and stepped outside to hang the wooden sign that told everyone the bakery was open. Old Mrs. Kovac was already walking up the hill with her wicker basket, just like she did every Tuesday for the past 10 years. The postman waved from across the street, and children ran past on their way to school, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. This was her world. Small, yes, but perfect in its own way. Everyone knew everyone. Secrets didn't last long, but neither did troubles, because neighbors always helped each other. When someone got sick, the whole village brought soup. When crops failed, families shared what they had. It was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and children played until dark without worry. Mara's younger brother Pavel came running into the bakery, his school bag bouncing on his shoulder. At 12 years old, he was all energy and mischief, always covered in dirt from climbing trees or chasing the village dogs. "Can I have some bread for lunch?" he asked, trying to look innocent while eyeing the fresh loaves cooling on the wooden racks. "Just one piece." Marija laughed, cutting him a thick slice and spreading it with butter. "And don't let Mama catch you eating it before you get to school." Their mother Anna was in the back room, kneading dough for the afternoon batch. She hummed old folk songs while she worked, the same melodies her own mother had taught her. Anna had run this bakery since she was Mara's age, taking over when her parents grew too old to lift the heavy flour sacks. "Marija, don't forget Stefan is coming for dinner tonight," Anna called out. "I'm making his favorite stew." Stefan. Just thinking about him made Marija smile. They had grown up together, playing in the same streets, attending the same small school. He was quiet and thoughtful, good with his hands, and could fix anything that broke. His carpentry shop was just 3 streets away, and sometimes Marija could hear the sound of his hammer and saw drifting on the evening breeze. They had been engaged for 6 months now, though they had known they would marry since they were children. It wasn't the kind of passionate romance you read about in books, but something deeper and more solid, like the mountains that surrounded their village. Their love was steady and enduring. The morning passed quickly. Customers came and went, buying their daily bread and staying to chat about village gossip. Mrs. Petrov's cow had gotten loose again. The church needed new roof tiles before winter. Young Tomislav had finally asked Maria to marry him, and everyone was excited about another wedding to celebrate. By noon, the last loaves were sold, and Marija helped her mother clean the flour from the wooden tables. This was their routine, as comfortable and familiar as breathing. After lunch, Marija would visit her grandmother, who lived in a tiny house near the church. In the evening, Stefan would come for dinner, and they would sit on the porch talking about their plans. They wanted to build a house on the hill overlooking the valley. Stefan had already chosen the spot and drawn sketches of how it would look. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a garden where Marija could grow vegetables and flowers. They would have children who would run through these same streets, attend the same school, and grow up surrounded by the same love that had shaped them. But as Marija swept the bakery floor that afternoon, she noticed something different in the air. The birds seemed quieter than usual. Even the dogs had stopped their playful barking, and strange tension hung over the village like a cloud before a storm. Old Mr. Jovanovic came into the bakery, his face more serious than she had ever seen it. He was the village's unofficial leader, the man people turned to when important decisions needed to be made. Today, his usual smile was nowhere to be found. "Have you heard the news from the radio?" he asked quietly. Marija shook her head. Few people in the village owned radios, and news from the outside world rarely seemed important to their daily lives. "There are soldiers moving through the valley," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've already passed through 3 villages to the south." The words hit her like cold water. Soldiers meant war, and war was something that happened in faraway places to other people. "Not here," Not in their peaceful mountain village, where the biggest excitement was usually a disagreement about whose turn it was to ring the church bells. That evening, Stefan came for dinner as planned, but the usual warmth was missing from the meal. Anna's stew tasted the same, but conversation was stilted and nervous. Pavel asked too many questions about soldiers, and their father kept looking out the window as if expecting to see something terrible approaching. After dinner, Stefan and Marija walked to their favorite spot by the old oak tree at the edge of the village. The stars were bright overhead, and the valley spread out below them like a dark blanket dotted with the warm yellow lights. From house windows, everything will be fine, Stefan said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Wars don't last forever. We'll wait it out, and then we'll build our house and have our life together. Marija wanted to believe him. She tried to imagine their future children playing under this same oak tree, but for the first time, the future felt uncertain and distant. They didn't sleep well that night. The village was too quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something they couldn't name, but could feel approaching like thunder in the distance. Morning came too soon and too dark. Instead of golden sunlight, heavy gray clouds covered the sky. Marija started her usual routine, mixing dough and lighting the ovens. But her hand shook slightly as she worked. Then she heard it, a low rumbling sound that grew louder and louder until it filled the air completely. She ran to the window and saw them coming down the mountain road. Trucks filled with armed men in gray uniforms, their faces hard and cold as winter stone. The life she had known for 19 years was about to end, though she didn't understand it yet. In a few hours, the bakery would be empty and cold. Her family would be scattered like seeds in a harsh wind. Stefan would disappear into the chaos, and she would become something she had never imagined possible. A prisoner, a piece of property, to be claimed by strangers. But in that moment, watching from her bakery window as the trucks rolled into her village, Marija was still herself. Still the girl who knew every face and every story in this small mountain community. Still the daughter who helped her mother bake bread, and the young woman who planned to marry the carpenter who could fix anything that was broken. She didn't know that some things, once broken, could never be repaired. She didn't know that her old life was ending and a new, impossible story was about to begin. The truck ride lasted 3 days, though Marija lost count of time somewhere between the second night and the endless bumping over rough roads. 37 women sat pressed together in the back of the military vehicle, their faces blank with shock and exhaustion. Some cried quietly, others stared at nothing. A few whispered prayers in voices so soft they barely disturbed the air. Marija found herself squeezed between an older woman who kept muttering her children's names and a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. The younger girl shook constantly, and Marija found herself putting a protective arm around her shoulders, offering what little comfort she could in this nightmare they all shared. When the truck finally stopped, they were at a grand estate that looked like something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales included armed guards and high fences topped with wire. The house was 3 stories tall with elegant windows and carved stone details. Gardens that had once been beautiful now showed signs of neglect, though someone was trying to keep them maintained. The women were lined up in the main courtyard while officers in crisp uniforms looked them over, like farmers examining livestock. At market, Marija kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to show the fear that made her stomach feel hollow and cold. Captain Wilhelm Hoffman stood apart from the other officers. At 32, he was older than most, with serious gray eyes and brown hair that was always perfectly combed. His uniform was pressed and clean, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of discipline and order. When his turn came to choose, he walked slowly down the line, barely glancing at most of the women. When he reached Marija, he stopped. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Not cruelty or hunger, but a kind of tired emptiness, as if he was going through the motions of something he didn't really want to do. This one, he said quietly to his aide, then turned and walked away without another word. Marija was taken to the servants' quarters on the second floor of the great house. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a tiny window that looked out over the gardens. After sleeping on the ground for 3 days, even this simple space felt like luxury. An orderly named Klaus, a thin man with kind eyes who spoke broken Serbian, explained her duties. She would maintain the captain's quarters, prepare his meals, and keep the household running smoothly. In return, she would receive basic necessities and be treated according to military regulations. For civilian workers, the captain is fair but strict, Klaus told her in his careful, slow Serbian. Follow the rules. Work hard, and you will be safe. Safe. The word felt strange. Was anyone really safe anymore? Captain Hoffman ran his household like he ran everything else, with military precision, every morning at exactly 7 o'clock. He expected his breakfast on the small table by the window in his study, coffee, black. 2 pieces of toast, no butter. 1 boiled egg, exactly for minutes, the newspaper, if one was available, folded neatly beside his plate. Marija learned his routines quickly. He woke at 5:30 and exercised in his room for 30 minutes. He shaved with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. His uniforms were always perfect, his desk always organized, his books arranged in perfect rows on their shelves. At first, their interactions were purely functional. He would tell her what he needed in careful, slow German, and she would nod and complete the task. He never raised his voice or showed impatience when she struggled with the language. When she made mistakes, he would simply repeat his instructions more slowly. But Marija noticed things. The captain kept a photograph on his desk, a woman with gentle eyes into small children. Sometimes she caught him staring at it with an expression of such sadness that she had to look away. He received letters regularly, but rarely seemed happy to read them. Often, he would write responses late into the night, then tear them up and start over. His bookshelf held volumes of poetry alongside military manuals. In the evenings, when his official duties were finished, he would often sit by the window reading Rilke or Goethe. His face soft in the lamplight. Sometimes his lips would move silently, as if he was reciting favorite passages from memory. The other officers visited regularly for meetings and meals. Marija served them efficiently, becoming nearly invisible as they discussed military matters. Over their dinner, she learned to understand more German than she let on, and what she heard made her stomach turn. These men spoke of villages and people as if they were pieces on a chessboard, problems to be solved rather than human lives. But Captain Hoffman was different during these meetings. He spoke when spoken to, answered questions directly, and carried out his orders without complaint. Yet Marija sensed his discomfort in the way he held his shoulders rigid and kept his answers brief. When the other officers made crude jokes or boasted about their conquests, he would find reasons to excuse himself from the room. One evening, about 2 months after her arrival, Marija was cleaning the captain's study when she accidentally knocked over a small music box on his shelf. As it fell, it began to play a delicate melody, a lullaby that sounded German, but felt universal in its gentle sadness. Captain Hoffman appeared in the doorway just as she was carefully picking up the pieces. She expected anger, punishment, but instead he knelt beside her and gently took the broken music box from her hands. "It was my daughter's," he said quietly in German, then repeated it more slowly when he saw she didn't understand. Mein Tochter. Marija knew enough German now to understand. His daughter. She looked at the photograph on his desk with new understanding. Those weren't just any children, they were his children. "I'm sorry," she managed in her careful German. "Es tut mir leid." He shook his head. "It was already broken," he said, this time in Serbian that was rough but understandable. "Everything is broken." It was the first time he had spoken to her about anything other than household duties. The first time she had seen him as anything other than the perfect military officer. For just a moment, she glimpsed the man behind the uniform, someone who was perhaps as displaced and homesick as she was. Though in a very different way. After that evening, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, but in small ways that were hard to define. When he gave her instructions, he would sometimes add please in Serbian. When she brought his morning coffee, he would nod his thanks instead of simply taking it without acknowledgement. The change was so subtle that anyone watching would barely notice it. But in a world where she had become invisible, where she was treated as property rather than a person, even these tiny gestures of recognition felt enormous. Marija began to wonder about his story. What had brought a man who kept poetry on his shelves and carried pictures of his children to this place where he had to treat human beings as prizes of war? What did he think about during those long evenings when he sat by the window, staring out at the gardens? She was still his prisoner, still trapped in a situation she had never chosen. But slowly, carefully, she was beginning to see that perhaps he was trapped too, just in a different kind of cage. The thought didn't make her situation any easier, but it made the man who controlled her fate seem less like a monster and more like another human being caught in circumstances neither of them had wanted. Winter was coming, and with it, changes that would test everything she thought she understood about survival, dignity, and the strange relationship developing between a captive woman and the officer who held her life in his hands. The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning in November, covering the estate grounds in a blanket of pristine white that made everything look peaceful and innocent. Marija watched from the kitchen window as she prepared Captain Hoffman's breakfast, thinking how the snow reminded her of home. Her village always looked magical in winter, with icicles hanging from the bakery windows and children building snowmen in the square. But this winter would be different from any she had ever known. It started with a simple mistake. Marija had been feeling unwell for several days, tired and dizzy with a persistent headache. That made it hard to concentrate. She tried to hide her discomfort, knowing that showing weakness could be dangerous. But when she was carrying the captain's afternoon tea to the study, her vision suddenly blurred and she stumbled. The tea service crashed to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Hot liquid splashed across the wooden floors, and the delicate porcelain cups shattered into countless pieces. Marija dropped to her knees immediately, trying to clean up the mess with her bare hands, cutting herself on the sharp fragments. Captain Hoffman appeared in the doorway within seconds, drawn by the noise. Marija braced herself for anger, for punishment, for whatever consequences came with damaging military property. Instead, she heard his boots cross the floor quickly, and then he was kneeling beside her. "Stop," he said firmly in German, then repeated it in Serbian. "Stop. You're bleeding." He gently took her hands and examined the small cuts on her palms. His touch was careful, professional, like someone who had treated wounds before. Without another word, he helped her to her feet and guided her to a chair. "Klaus," he called to his orderly, "bring the medical kit." For the next few minutes, Captain Hoffman cleaned and bandaged her cuts with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. His hands were steady and gentle, and he worked in silence except for occasional instructions to hold still or move her fingers. "You have fever," he observed, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. "How long?" 3 days, Marija admitted, quietly, then added in German, "I'm sorry about the tea." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Tea can be replaced," he said. "Go to your room and rest." But instead of getting better, Marija got worse. By evening, her fever had spiked and she was delirious, calling out for her mother and Pavel in Serbian while burning with heat that no blanket could ease. Klaus checked on her regularly, reporting back to the captain with growing concern. At midnight, Captain Hoffman made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He called for the camp doctor, a German physician who normally only treated officers and important personnel. When Klaus questioned the decision, suggesting that prisoner medical care wasn't standard protocol, the captain's response was short and final. "Do it." Dr. Mueller arrived within an hour, grumbling about being called out for a prisoner, but carrying his medical bag nonetheless. He examined Marija thoroughly, checked her temperature, and listened to her labored breathing with his stethoscope. "Pneumonia," he diagnosed, early stage, but serious. She needs rest, medication, and careful monitoring. In her weakened condition, he didn't finish the sentence. But the implication was clear. Captain Hoffman arranged for Marija to be moved to a larger room on the ground floor where Klaus could check on her more easily. He personally ensured she received the prescribed medication and ordered special meals of soup and bread to help her regain strength. For 3 days, Marija drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in Serbian to people who weren't there, sometimes lying silent and still as death. Captain Hoffman found himself checking on her progress more often than necessary, telling himself it was simply concern for household efficiency. On the 4th day, her fever finally broke. Marija woke to find herself in an unfamiliar room. Weak but clear-headed for the first time in a week, Klaus was sitting in a chair nearby, reading a letter from home. The captain will be pleased, Klaus said when he saw her eyes open. He was very worried. The word struck her as strange. Why would her captor worry about her health beyond her usefulness as a servant? That evening, Captain Hoffman came to check on her recovery personally. He entered the room quietly, as if unsure whether she was sleeping, and seemed surprised to find her sitting up in bed. Alert and watching him? Better, he asked in his careful Serbian. Yes, thank you, she replied, then added in German, Dank schön. He nodded and turned to leave, but something made him pause in the doorway. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. You called for your mother, he said. When you were sick, you spoke of a bakery and a brother named Pavel. Marija felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her family. She had tried so hard not to think about them, not to wonder whether they were alive or dead, safe or suffering. I had a family too, Captain Hoffman continued, still facing the door rather than looking at her. A wife, 2 children. Anna was 7. Franz was 4. His voice caught slightly on the names. They died in a bombing raid 6 months ago. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief to people who had lost everything, sitting in a room where one was supposed to be the other's enemy, finding something unexpected in their mutual pain. From that night forward, their evening conversations became a ritual neither acknowledged but both looked forward to. After his official duties were finished and the other officers had retired, Captain Hoffman would find reasons to check on household matters, and Marija would be completing her tasks. In the common areas, they talked carefully at first, sharing memories of peacetime that felt safe to remember. Marija told him about helping her mother bake bread, about the way her village celebrated harvest festivals, about teaching Pavel to read using their grandmother's old prayer book. Captain Hoffman spoke of his children's laughter, of the piano his wife used to play on Sunday evenings, of the small house with a garden where they had been so happy. You were a teacher? Marija asked one evening, noticing how naturally he explained things and how many books filled his personal shelves. Literature professor. He confirmed, at the university in Munich. I taught Goethe and Schiller to students who thought poetry was old-fashioned. He smiled slightly at the memory. I told them that poetry survives because it speaks to something eternal in the human heart. Do you still believe that? She asked quietly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered gardens. I want to, he said finally. Some days I think I've forgotten how to believe in anything beautiful. These conversations revealed the man behind the uniform, someone who had been swept into this war by forces beyond his control, just as she had been, someone who performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, because the alternative was to think too deeply about what those duties meant. But the other officers were beginning to notice the captain's unusual attention to his household. Servant. Major Fisher made pointed comments about proper distance between officers and prisoners. Lieutenant Weber joked crudely about the captain's soft spot for his domestic help. Captain Hoffman felt their scrutiny like a weight on his shoulders, but found himself unable to return to the cold detachment that had once defined his treatment of Marija. She had become real to him, not a prize of war or a piece of property, but a human being with her own story of loss and survival. For Marija, the change was equally profound. This man represented everything that had destroyed her life, yet she was beginning to see past the uniform to the person underneath. Someone who missed his children's laughter and carried worn poetry books in his jacket pocket. Someone who had shown her kindness when he could have shown indifference or cruelty. As winter deepened and the war continued its relentless course, both Marija and Captain Hoffman found themselves facing an impossible truth in the midst of hatred and violence. Something resembling friendship had grown between them. It was fragile and complicated and dangerous for both of them, but it was also the only thing that made their current existence bearable, and neither was willing to give it up, despite the risks that grew larger with each passing day. The telegram arrived on a gray February morning when the world still felt frozen in winter's grip. Captain Hoffman was reviewing supply reports when Klaus knocked on his study door, holding the official communication with the kind of careful respect reserved for orders that could change everything. Wilhelm opened the sealed envelope and read the contents twice, his face growing paler with each word. New orders. His unit was being transferred to the Eastern Front within 2 weeks. All equipment and personnel were to be ready for immediate deployment. Standard protocol for prisoner disposal was to be followed before departure. He set the telegram down with hands that trembled slightly, then dismissed Klaus and locked his office door. For the first time since becoming an officer, Wilhelm Hoffman allowed himself to show the fear that lived beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Standard protocol. Everyone knew what those words meant, though no one spoke them aloud. Prisoners who couldn't be transferred to labor camps were to be eliminated efficiently and quietly. It was considered a practical matter, like disposing of any other unnecessary equipment before a major move. Wilhelm stared out his window at the gardens, where Marija sometimes walked in the afternoons, reading the book of Serbian poetry he had quietly obtained for her from a contact in town. In 2 weeks, those gardens would be empty and she would be gone forever. Another casualty of a war that seemed to devour everything good in the world. The thought hit him like a physical blow, somewhere over the past months, without realizing it. He had begun to think of Marija not as his prisoner, but as the one person who understood the weight he carried. Their evening conversations had become the only time when he could drop the mask of military efficiency and remember who he used to be. She knew about his children now, about his wife Helena's laugh and how she used to hum while preparing dinner. She had told him about her dreams of marrying Stefan and building a house on the hill overlooking her village. They shared memories and fears in a way that made the war feel distant and less important than the simple human need for connection. Now, he was supposed to sign an order that would end her life as casually as he might requisition new boots for his soldiers. The next few days passed in a haze of preparation and mounting dread. Wilhelm went through the motions of organizing the transfer, while his mind worked frantically on a problem that seemed impossible to solve. He could not follow orders and live with himself, but he could not disobey orders without facing a military court and certain execution. The other officers were excited about their new assignment, eager for more active duty after months of administrative work. Major Fisher boasted about the opportunities for advancement that combat positions offered. Lieutenant Weber speculated about the prisoners they might take in their next campaign. At least we won't have to worry about the current prisoners, Fisher mentioned over dinner one evening, his meaning clear to everyone at the table. Clean slate for the new assignment. Wilhelm nodded and made appropriate responses. But inside he felt sick. These men were talking about human lives as if they were discussing livestock, to be butchered before moving to a new farm. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced his room like a caged animal, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. Military law was absolute. Orders were orders. The system that had shaped his entire adult life left no room for individual conscience when it conflicted with duty. But then he remembered something Marija had said during one of their conversations. She had been telling him about her grandmother, who had hidden Jewish families in her cellar during the last war. People told her it was too dangerous. Marija had said that she would get her whole family killed for strangers. But grandmother said that some things are more important than being safe. She said that if you can't look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud of who you are, then you're already dead inside, standing in his darkened room. Staring at his reflection in the window glass, Wilhelm realized he had been dead inside for months. Following orders, maintaining discipline, serving the machine of war while his humanity slowly suffocated. Under the weight of his uniform, the decision, when it finally came, felt less like choosing and more like remembering who he used to be. The next evening, Wilhelm asked Marija to stay after she finished her usual tasks. She sensed something different in his manner, a tension that made the air between them feel charged with unspoken words. "We need to talk," he said in Serbian, then switched to German when the words came easier. "My unit is being transferred. In 10 days, Marija nodded, unsurprised. Military movements were common, and she had learned not to ask too many questions about things that didn't directly concern her survival. Standard protocol requires a Wilhelm stopped, unable to finish the sentence. How do you tell someone that regulations demand their death? But Marija understood anyway. She had always been quick to read the meanings behind words, and the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been coursing through her. "I won't do it," Wilhelm said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I can't. I won't follow that order." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the implications of what he had just said. Refusing to follow military orders was treason. The penalty was death for both of them. "What are you saying?" Marija asked, though she already knew. "I'm saying we leave," Wilhelm replied, his voice growing stronger as the plan took shape in his mind. "Together. I have access to travel, documents, civilian clothes, money. We can be gone before anyone realizes what happened." "You would give up everything?" Marija stared at him in disbelief. "Your rank, your future, your whole life?" Wilhelm looked around his elegant quarters, at the uniform hanging perfectly pressed in his wardrobe, at the medals and commendations that represented years of service. None of it meant anything anymore. It was all just costume jewelry on a corpse. "What life?" he asked. "Following orders that make me sick? Pretending to be proud of things that shame me? I stopped living months ago. I've just been going through the motions." Over the next week, Wilhelm began careful preparations. He used his authority to obtain civilian identification papers, claiming they were needed for an intelligence operation. He converted his savings to cash in foreign currency. Most importantly, he began studying maps and transportation schedules, looking for a route that would take them far from the war and the reach of military justice. The plan was dangerous and probably impossible. If they were caught, both would face immediate execution, even if they escaped successfully. They would spend the rest of their lives as fugitives, always looking over their shoulders. Never truly safe. But as Wilhelm watched Marija reading by lamplight in the evenings, as he listened to her quiet humming while she worked, as he saw the way she carefully tended the small plant she had coaxed to grow on her windowsill, he knew that some risks were worth taking. On their last evening in the estate, they sat together, in his study, not talking about their fears or the uncertainty that lay ahead. Instead, they shared memories of better times, as if storing up warmth for the cold journey that awaited them. "Are you afraid?" Marija asked as the clock struck midnight. Wilhelm considered the question seriously. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of living as someone I hate. I'd rather die as someone I can respect." Marija reached across the small space between them and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched since he had bandaged her cuts months ago, and the simple contact felt like a promise and a blessing all at once. Tomorrow they would leave behind everything they had ever known and step into an uncertain future together. Tonight, they were no longer captor and prisoner, officer and servant. They were two people who had found something worth saving in each other, something precious enough to risk everything to protect. The war would continue without them, grinding on with its endless appetite for destruction. But Wilhelm and Marija had chosen a different path, one that led away from the machinery of hatred and towards something that felt like hope. The border crossing into Switzerland happened at dawn, when the world was painted in soft shades of gray and pink. Wilhelm and Marija sat in the back of a farmer's cart, buried under sacks of grain and trying not to breathe too loudly. The old farmer, a man named Otto who smuggled people for reasons he never explained, had picked them up 3 miles from the Austrian checkpoint. "Stay quiet no matter what happens," Otto had whispered before covering them with the heavy canvas. "These guards know me, but they're still suspicious of everyone." Marija felt Wilhelm's hand find hers in the darkness under the grain sacks. His palm was damp with sweat, and she could feel his heart beating fast through his thin civilian coat. They had been traveling for 6 days now, moving only at night, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, living on bread and water that Wilhelm had packed in his small rucksack. The cart stopped. Footsteps approached, voices in German, casual but alert. "Morning, Otto. What are you carrying today?" "Same as always," the farmer replied. "Grain for the mill in Zurich. Good harvest this year, thank God." There was movement above them as someone poked at the sacks. Marija held her breath and pressed closer to Wilhelm. Feeling his arm tighten protectively around her shoulders, "Everything looks normal." The guard said finally, "Safe travels." The cart lurched forward again, and they were through, free, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Otto pulled the canvas away and helped them climb out. "Welcome to Switzerland," he said with a tired smile. "Tried to stay out of trouble." Wilhelm pressed the last of his money into the old man's hands. But Otto shook his head and pushed half of it back. "Keep it," he said. "You need it more than I do. Starting over isn't cheap." They walked the final 3 miles to the village of Kleindorf on foot, carrying everything they owned in Wilhelm's small bag. The mountain air was clean and sharp, so different from the heavy atmosphere of the military compound they had left behind. Birds sang in the trees, and wildflowers grew along the path as if the war was something that happened only in bad dreams. The village was tiny, maybe to 100 people at most, with a single main street lined with wooden houses that had stood for generations. A small church sat on a hill overlooking farms that stretched toward distant mountains. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately, but not necessarily unwelcome. They told their story carefully to the village mayor, a practical woman named Rosa who had seen many refugees pass through during the war years. Wilhelm and Marija were husband and wife, they said, displaced from their home in Austria when their village was bombed. They had no papers except the forged documents Wilhelm had created. No relatives to vouch for them, only each other and a desperate need to start fresh. Rosa studied them with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than they were saying. But Switzerland had a long tradition of offering sanctuary to those fleeing violence, and she was more interested in their willingness to work than their past. "We need help at the Muller farm," she said finally. "They lost their son in an accident last spring and can't manage all the work alone. It's hard labor, but honest. There's a small cottage on the property where you can live." The cottage was one room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and 2 chairs that had seen better days. The roof leaked in one corner, and the windows were cracked, but it was theirs. For 2 people who had spent months living under the constant threat of discovery, it felt like a palace. Their first months in Kleindorf were the hardest either of them had ever experienced. Wilhelm's hands, soft from years of paperwork and command, cracked and bled from farm labor. He learned to milk cows, repair fences, and harvest crops under the patient instruction of Hans Muller, the farmer who had given them work. Marija helped Frau Muller with the housework and cooking, but her real talent emerged when she offered to bake bread for the family. Her first loaves were disasters. She had forgotten how different flours and ovens could be. But gradually her skills returned. Soon, neighbors were asking to buy her bread, and she began to dream of having a bakery again someday. The nightmares came regularly in those early months. Wilhelm would wake up screaming, reliving battles he wished he could forget. Marija would cry in her sleep, calling for her mother and Pavel, wondering if they were still alive somewhere. They learned to comfort each other through the dark hours, holding tight until morning brought the mercy of daylight and honest work. Slowly, carefully, they began to build a life together. What had started as a desperate escape gradually became something deeper. They were no longer just two people running from the past, but two people choosing to create a future together. Wilhelm discovered he had a talent for woodworking, probably inherited from some distant ancestor. In the evenings, after the farm work was done, he would carve small toys and decorative boxes that Marija could sell at the weekly market. His hands, which had once signed orders that caused suffering, now created things that brought joy to children. Mara's bread became famous throughout the valley. People would travel from neighboring villages just to buy her special honey wheat loaves and the sweet pastries she made on Sundays. She saved every coin, dreaming of the day when they could rent a proper bakery space. 2 years after their arrival, they were married in the village church by Pastor Weber, a kind old man who asked no difficult questions about their past. Hans and Frau Muller stood as witnesses, along with Rosa and a dozen other villagers who had become their friends and chosen family. The wedding was simple but beautiful. Marija wore a white dress that Frau Muller had sewn specially for the occasion. Wilhelm had found a small gold ring at the market in the next town over, using money he had saved from selling his wooden carvings. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges life might bring, there wasn't a dry eye in the little church. Their first child, a daughter they named Anna after Mara's mother, was born the following spring. Wilhelm cried when he held her for the first time, thinking of his other children who would never grow up, but also overwhelmed with gratitude for this second chance at family. More children followed: Pavel, named for Mara's lost brother, and little Helena, who had Wilhelm's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. They raised their family in the expanded cottage that Wilhelm had renovated with his own hands, teaching their children to speak both German and Serbian, to value kindness over strength, and to never take their peaceful life for granted. When the war finally ended, they faced the question of whether to reveal their true identities. Wilhelm could have reclaimed his academic credentials, returned to teaching literature at a university, but they decided together that their new life was worth more than their old names. They became true Swiss citizens, contributing members of a community that had welcomed them without judgment. Wilhelm never taught Goethe again, but he read poetry to his children every night before bed. Marija never returned to her village, but she created new traditions and celebrations that honored her heritage, while embracing her chosen home. In their final years, when grandchildren played in the garden behind their expanded bakery, visitors would sometimes comment on the obvious love between the elderly couple. How lucky they were, people would say, to have found such happiness together. Wilhelm and Marija would smile and agree, but they never told the full story of how that love had begun. Some truths were too complex for casual conversation, too precious to share with anyone who hadn't lived through the darkness that made their light so brilliant. They had learned that love could grow in the most impossible places, between the most unlikely people, that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in following orders or fighting enemies, but in choosing compassion over duty, hope over despair, and each other over everything else the world tried to tear apart. Their story became part of the village's quiet history, passed down through generations as proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, two people could choose to build something beautiful together.